Okay, well, good morning to the guests that I have with me. Good morning and good afternoon or good evening to all of our guests out there watching with us on our live recording here, whoever you may be and wherever you may be. Today we are hosting a 2-hour, 2-credit CE course for insurance professionals. This class is being filmed on Halloween Day, so happy Halloween to everybody. And again, I'm really glad that you could all make it here today, whether you're here in person or you're out there getting credits wherever you may be. So the topic we have for discussion today is a very fitting topic, if you ask me. Biohazard recovery and cleanup on this Halloween day. So, if our guests out there watching this in a video recording, please take your Oregon CE roster, fill it out properly, make sure your course number reflects 1019255, and that you filled it out properly with both your agent license number and the time in at 9 a.m., please. Moving on. My name is Sean Lapoth. I work here at ServPro of Salem West, here in Salem, Oregon. Been here for 3 years. I'm very proud to do what I do here at ServPro. I'm a marketing representative and PR in the community, but also our franchise strives very hard to cross-train everybody in all fields. So I have some first-hand knowledge with the topic that we're discussing today. The guests I have with me have already introduced themselves. If this is a live stream back at home, you can introduce yourself on the web. But let's move on. So, with the guests I have with me, attendance, you must attend the entire time. Those at home, you must watch the entire length of the video to gain the class credits. Classroom protocol is that we have bathrooms right down these stairs out here, and take note of both our emergency exits should you need. Those of you at home, if you're watching this in a group or a class, please, 1, take note of your restrooms, and 2, take note of your emergency exits. So let's take a look at the objectives of today's course. There's a lot of things I hope to impart upon you about this topic, and this is just kind of a broad overview of what I hope you walk away with today. And one being to be able to define a biohazard or a blood-borne pathogen. I'd like to ask if any of you at home maybe could define biohazard. You can just think about that, because we'll get into it. We're going to define regulated waste. We're going to describe safety steps to prevent exposure, because in the workplace we are monitored by Osha, and a safe workplace is needed to be able to comply with this type of work. We're going to decide federal standards and regulations for applying to biohazard cleanup. These federal standards and regulations are how we develop these safety protocols, and we're going to explain certifications for this type of cleanup, as well as describing the characteristics of a good biohazard cleanup technician, describing the services provided. This is a service that's provided and it has value, and we're going to look at why that is, and understanding the nature of biohazard cleanup activities, because that service that adds value, it's got very clear nature to the things that we're trying to accomplish in these types of situations. So if we just take a bird's eye view really quick of what we're going to look at throughout the course, we're going to define biohazard. It's also known as crime scene cleanup in some cases. It's known as trauma scene cleanup in some cases. If we take a second and define biohazard, biohazard is a substance or situation that is hazardous to your health, or a biological entity. I am biological, and other biological things could present a biohazard, what's the word I'm looking for, threat to me, but it doesn't have to just be a chemical or blood or something that has happened. A biohazard could also be a situation. A situation can present a biohazard to me or you. So all that in trying to say that a biohazard could be a substance, but it could also be a situation. And these can also be combined. You could have a blood-borne pathogen situation that also has a fall hazard. And so these both are biohazardous to me, and they can be considered biohazard. But there's only one that really applies to cleaning in our industry here at ServPro, and that's biohazard materials that actually present the threat. So we're going to be taking a look at the cleaning procedures today that we use to mitigate and recover biohazard scenes. But a situation, a specific situation, can also present a biohazard to you. Obviously, the OSHA standards and regulations that apply to all this cleanup, and training and certifications that we go through, that others go through, and that are standardized and necessary. So again, introduction to biohazard cleanup. What is a biohazard? A biohazard is something or a situation that presents a hazard to me. Whether it's a respiratory hazard, or it's a skin contact hazard, or a sharps hazard. There's all sorts of different biohazardous situations that can present themselves if not properly identified or mitigated. Specialized skills are needed to be a biohazard technician or a recovery technician. And there's a really important skill in this that's needed. It's more important than all of them, if you ask me. We go right down the list with knowing how to work safely with the materials, knowing how to clean properly these materials, and knowing that this material needs this and that material needs that. But the most important skill needed for this type of work is definitely knowing how to respond to customers. Customers experiencing this type of situation, customers experiencing traumatic cases or trauma in their lives, whether it's family members, whether it's their own home, whether it's pets or the environment around them. Biohazards can present themselves in many ways. We are going to specifically look at the blood-borne pathogens section of biohazards today, but knowing how to interact with the customers that we come in contact with during these situations is one of the best qualities of a good biohazard technician. And that leads to having fortitude for the work. Not all cleaners can perform a trauma scene cleanup. Cleaners are required to work around human blood and dead bodies at some times. Cleanup can involve blood, cleaning blood off structures and contents, removing materials soaked with blood. It could also include working around severed or dismembered body parts. It can be very mentally taxing. If I recall, one of the biohazard scenes that I've been on throughout my career here at ServPro, just having the fortitude for the work, you try and prepare yourself the best you can, but you're not always prepared for what ends up showing up. I remember I was on scene once, and the thing I found myself unprepared for was just the immense amount of crying from an entire church congregation that had showed up at this scene in respect for the loss. And so you could just hear that the entire time on scene, just an immense amount of crying happening outside the scene. And I found myself recognizing that, and that it was tough it was taxing on the mind to have to deal with that. And so we made it through that situation, and it was a very sad situation, but that was something that I was unprepared for in that instance, but experience is always key in some of these cases. Biohazard technicians, companies like ServPro, here at ServPro of Salem West, companies that do biohazard cleanup, they're not required, employees of those companies are not required to do biohazard cleanup. An employer cannot force an employee to do biohazard cleanup. An employee has to be willing to do biohazard cleanup. An employee can make the designation whether he is willing to do biohazard or trauma scene cleanup before the work, during the work, or after the work. And so at any time, a biohazard technician can make the determination that I am not prepared for this, I do not have the stomach for this, I don't want to be here. And so finding the right technician to do this type of work is very key. Not only does he have to have the stomach, the fortitude for it, but he also has to be very customer-oriented. Empathetic is a word we use in this situation, but not overzealous. Customers rarely have a smile on their face when they call us, especially to deal with this topic. But moving on. Can anybody define a blood-borne pathogen for me? Just 1 second there. That's right, you're right. A blood-borne pathogen is an infectious agent in blood. So there's a lot of different things that can affect us. You know, there's carcinogens in this world, there's fungi in this world, there's mold in this world. All these things can affect our health. But a blood-borne pathogen is an infectious agent and found in blood. Blood-borne, and then pathogen, we can take the root word path. And so we know that this entity, whether it be a virus or a fungi, has to take the path of blood to a new host. So a blood-borne pathogen is an infectious agent, and that term infectious will come up later in comparison to some other things that we face in our society. These infectious agents, they cause disease. Hepatitis B and HIV are obviously the most common with dealing with this type of situation or this type of subject. Blood-borne illnesses are very vast, but the most common are hepatitis B and HIV. Workers exposed to blood-borne pathogens risk, of course, serious illness and death, which is why this type of work is both heavily regulated and very dangerous. Hepatitis V, Hpv virus, contracting this can cause anorexia, malice, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, jaundice. Infected persons can have HPV in their blood, serum-like body fluids, saliva, semen. Infection can result in damage to the liver. That's the liver is taking the brunt of HPV when it comes to uninfected individual. So if we take a look at a quick kind of back and forth here, it kind of illustrates the toxicity of the different fluids that you might find from a body concerning infectious HPV. So we can see over here on this high end that HPV, an individual that's contracted HPV is going to have high levels of the virus, both in their blood, their serum, their wound exudates. These are the high risk fluids as far as contracting or gaining that pathogen onto yourself. Obviously, there are other fluids that are more moderate with the infection, including vaginal fluids, semen, saliva, and then low, not detectable. We're talking about urine, feces, sweat. Now, this scale is largely accurate for HIV as well. HIV is slightly more present in things such as breast milk and semen. And so the scale is largely applicable to HIV as well. Talk about hepatitis for a second. Hepatitis A, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and hepatitis E are obviously the type of hepatitis that you might come across in an individual that you would want to be prepared for. But there's a rule of thumb, if you will. Hepatitis A and E, I remember that just by thinking of the TV network A&E. But hepatitis A and E can be contracted through these types of serums more readily than these types: urine, feces, sweat, breast milk, whereas HBV and HBC are largely contracted through the blood, the serum, the pus. HBV prevention, though, there are steps to be taken to make sure that HBV is not contracted, especially in biohazard technicians, recovery technicians. There's an Hpv vaccine. Now, vaccines are just that. They are a vaccination. They are preemptive. Vaccine is a preemptive step to not contracting the virus should you come in contact with it. Occupants at risk of acquiring HPV infection through exposure are obviously medical personnel, including dentists. Medical laboratory personnel is a designation of somebody who could come in contact with an HPV infectious material or blood-borne pathogen. Public service employees, it's probably rare in that case, but they are often there. Staff in institutions, classrooms for the mentally challenged, and of course biohazard cleaning technicians such as us here at ServPro. The vaccination for HPV must be made available by the employer to all employees who are designated to possibly have to work in a situation where HPV may be present. So in any company that provides biohazard recovery services, that employer must make available the HPV vaccine to all employees that will be performing the work at no cost, at a reasonable time and place, and performed by a licensed physician. HIV and AIDS. We all have some level of knowledge of this subject. Human immune deficiency of virus. And as the virus grows within the body and gets to certain levels, it progresses onto HIV, or AIDS, excuse me, acquired immune deficiency virus, which is uncurable. HIV virus is transmitted by means of body fluids, especially blood and sexual secretions. You remember that with the scale that we went through. Preventing exposure. We've kind of talked on this a little bit with the HPV vaccine, but that only is a preventative measure for HPV. Preventing exposure is key to making our work as recovery technicians successful. Employers must train employees on how to protect themselves, and these safety procedures, outlined mainly in OSHA guidelines and standards, include universal precautions, engineering and work practice controls, housekeeping. I'm sure you guys have heard that word before, but we're going to learn how it applies to biohazard cleanup, personal protection equipment, and proper handling of regulated waste, which biohazardous material is. So has anybody ever heard the term universal precautions before? Think about it to yourself at home. Has anybody ever heard the term engineering work practice controls before? Engineering and work practice controls. Those are two separate things. I'm sure everybody's heard of housekeeping, but think about how it might apply to a situation such as this. Personal protection equipment. We use an acronym for personal protection equipment, PPE, which you will hear come up a couple more times in the presentation. That's what that means. We're referring to equipment that protects my person. It doesn't do very well to protecting anybody else but just mine. So some examples of that might be gloves, goggles, footwear, suits. These are all things that qualify as personal protective equipment, PPE. And then, of course, proper handling of regulated waste. Think about what that might entail, because we're going to get into it. So looking first at universal precautions. What does universal precautions mean? It means to always be cautious. That's pretty much what that term means. But applying it to biohazard recovery work means that if I'm approaching a biohazardous scene, I am not going to try and identify exactly what hazard is contained in that biohazardous substance. I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just going to assume that this scene or this substance is hazardous to the highest level. If we're talking about blood or other types of body fluids, I'm not going to worry about what's in that blood or body fluids. I'm just going to assume, and HIV is the high end of that danger level, I'm just going to assume that this situation, that this blood, that this body fluid contains HIV to protect myself. Because if I assume, then I'm going to take the proper precautions. So universal precautions, we are always assuming the worst. If you cannot identify the type of fluid, consider all fluids to be potentially infectious. That applies to bodily fluids mixing with other fluids on scene. That can be hard to identify at sometimes, but should it even come into question, take universal precautions. Nobody wants an exposure and then having to worry about that after the fact. Should I go get tested? Yes. Should I go see a physician? Yes, of course, but you could have prevented the exposure. So universal precautions. Engineering controls. I asked you to think about what an engineering or a work practice control might be. An engineering control is a procedure that removes or eliminates hazards from the workplace. A procedure that places a barrier between the worker and the hazard. And obviously an example is a sharps object container. So, because I've placed a sharps container on scene of my biohazard cleanup, I have engineered a safer way to transport any sort of contaminated or not sharps, contaminated or not. I've engineered a way to properly transport those sharps without causing any more danger or cross-contamination to anyone else. So that is how I engineered that work practice for sharps. If we look closely at work practice controls after that, Work practice control is the way I actually perform the task. Performing a work procedure in a certain manner reduces the likelihood of an employee exposure. Engineering controls and decisions about the workplace conditions, work practice controls and decisions about how to perform tasks. So if we just take a step back at the previous slide here, we look at my sharps container on scene of a needle cleanup is an engineering control to contain these sharps. A work practice control in the same situation would be to never place my hand inside the container as I put sharps into it. If you can imagine me sticking my hand all the way inside, that's a bad work practice control. Whereas if I have the little foot tab and I open it and I drop it in there from above, that is a good work practice control. You're not sticking your hand into something that could possibly puncture. So that's just me trying to illustrate the difference between a work practice control and an engineering control. Obviously, hand washing facilities need to be provided in these types of situations, both for potential exposures and for just decontamination. We use PPE, personal protective equipment, to protect ourselves, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't decontaminate ourselves after we've been on scene and after we've removed our PPE. And even in the case of an exposure, being able to clean is the key, because not everybody thinks disinfectant's most important, but yes, you do have to disinfect, but you can't disinfect before you clean. So hand washing facilities are key. Should it be unfeasible to put hand washing facilities on a scene, antiseptic, hand cleaners, towelettes need to be provided. An employee needs to be able to clean himself during this work, or have the ability to, outside of the contaminated area. Work smart and stay safe. These are more work practice controls, and they're some of the most overlooked ones. No eating or drinking or smoking on this scene inside the contaminated area. Especially even outside the contaminated area, because if your technician isn't savvy about cross-contamination, then eating, drinking, smoking could be doing just that, cross-contaminating, exposing that individual, and creating a problem. Do not store food or drink or near blood or potentially infectious materials, customers' items or customers' food items, or consumables that are in the contaminated area or have been directly contaminated should be largely considered for disposal. And of course, minimize splashing, spraying, and splattering of blood or infectious materials. That's key, both with the chemicals or the products that we use, as well as with the actual substance that we may be dealing with, because often it is liquid. Blood does dry at a fast rate, but often we can run into it and it's in liquid form, and making sure that that stays contained, or containing it in the proper manner, is key. Being aware of sharp objects. Now, of course, hypodermic needles do themselves, a used hypodermic needle creates a biohazard in itself. One being that it could potentially contain blood-borne pathogens, and also just it being on the ground is a situation, with the needle cap off, is a situation that is a biohazard, because that needle could poke me. One, in the wrong spot and cause harm, and two, could expose me to a blood-borne pathogen that used needle could have come in contact with. So to minimize these, you minimize any chance a worker could be cut by sharp edges or struck by a needle. Use puncture-resistant, leak-proof containers. Those are those sharps containers we just looked at a couple slides back. They're puncture-resistant and they're leak-proof. That's key for sharps. Because transport, we have to take these things off scene, and we need to be able to do that. And of course, that's regulated waste. Workers should not have to put their hands in a container. What is that again? That's a work practice control. I'm practicing good work because I'm not sticking my hands into that container where other sharps are and could possibly poke me, cause an exposure. Label containers directed by the Blood-Borne Pathogen standard. There are standards and guidelines about how blood-borne pathogens are stored and transported and disposed of. And that starts right at the scene. I can't put an infectious material into anything that isn't properly labeled. So I want to ask a question really quick to everybody who's out there watching as we look at this picture here. Get a little better for it, yeah. This particular biohazard technician is using, obviously he's got personal protective equipment on. Right there you can see he's got his glove to protect his hands. We can see the edge of a personal protective suit. And he's got duct tape to hold them together to make sure any liquids don't seep inside there. We can also see that he's got needle nose pliers he's using to pick up a sharp. It's one of the largest exposure hazards on a biohazard scene that involves sharps, is picking them up. Picking them up is a huge exposure potential. So this particular individual is using needle nose pliers and using them to grab the needle, the hypodermic needle by the needle, using the needle nose pliers to grab the syringe by the needle. And so I want to ask, is using the needle nose pliers a work practice control or an engineering control? I'll just let you all simmer on that at home. Housekeeping guidelines. The routine tasks that keep a work environment functioning. Of course, we all have our housekeeping guidelines we use in our home. Why do we do these things? Because it keeps our home or our place of work functioning properly. We need to function at a high level on a biohazard scene. We need to be able to operate without question and without risk. And so housekeeping is just as important as work practice controls or engineering controls or PPE. Housekeeping gets right down to it as well, because preparing a scene to be mitigated or recovered or disposed is just as important as actually doing the work. And so housekeeping, things such as clean and decontaminate equipment and surfaces, inspect decontaminant receptacles intended for reuse, using mechanical means to pick up broken glass, just like we saw with the needle, using a mechanical needle nose pliers to pick them up, is good housekeeping guidelines. Making sure you have a decontamination area separate from the contaminated area that the workers are going into and need to come back out of. These are very important housekeeping guidelines. So if we take a step back really quick to the pliers and the needle nose, this is actually one of the ones that straddles the line of work practice control and engineering control. He is showing good work practice by using the needle nose pliers. The needle nose pliers themselves can be considered a mechanical function in the workplace, providing safety, providing a means of safer disposal. So it could be considered an engineering control. I'm engineering a control to protect myself while picking this glass up, or I'm using good work practice controls by using these needle nose pliers to pick this glass up. So it's one of the ones that straddles the line. It is a mechanical device that is used. It's an engineering control and a work practice control, and we see that in housekeeping guidelines as well. Using mechanical means to pick up broken glass, handle laundry with protective gloves. On a biohazard scene, it's very often that you need to figure out a way to properly dispose of or clean or recover all sorts of items. All sorts of different items can become contaminated by a biohazard, especially blood-borne. And sometimes it boils down to whether that's that particular item or surface or situation is a porous material or a non-porous material, whether it's dried, whether it's still pooled. All these things need to be considered when creating a plan that includes good housekeeping. Personal protective equipment, PPE, may prevent infectious organisms from contacting the employee, and that's why we use that's why we use PPE. We are trying to protect the entire individual, the entire worker that we've put on scene. We want zero chance of an exposure. We need to limit the exposure chance to as close to zero as possible. Obviously, being a company that provides this work, we are regulated by OSHA. We have standards that need to be adhered to and guidelines that we have to be aware of. PPE protects all possible routes of exposure. Work clothes, street shoes, undergarments, employee skin, eyes, mouth, or other mucous membranes. So if you don't have proper PPE on the scene of a biohazard cleanup, let's just say shoes, for example. Let's say we've got a technician cleaning a blood-borne pathogen on scene, and he hasn't covered the shoes that he's come to work in. And so that's fine. He might not experience an exposure right here on scene doing the work, but those shoes are going to track through what he's kind of trying to clean, very potentially, and those shoes are going to come back with him through the contaminated area, through the rest of whatever area he's in, back onto the truck that we sent him there in, back here to the shop that he came from, and then even more so back home to where he lives. He's going to be cross-contaminating all these areas, including his home, with what he stepped in prior. And if you have small children that play on your floor, tracking home what you went through at work isn't necessarily a good work practice control. So PPE has to be used properly. PPE has to be used every time. Employers ensure employees use proper PPE. And PPE can mean I need this here for this situation and I don't need it for this situation. I need to make sure I apply this PPE correctly. We're going to kind of get into that later about what are the steps taken to apply this PPE properly. Because if it's not applied properly, it's not going to do what it's meant to do. OSHA requirements for PPE. Employers, not employees, employers must perform a hazard assessment of the workplace. And this is a plan. This is every workplace, especially involving biohazard cleanup, is individual, is unique. So a plan must be created every time to address this unique situation. We have guidelines and standards that let us know how to go about this planning process, but the plan itself is going to be slightly different in any situation. And so performing that hazard assessment is key. There's obviously a hazard here when we're dealing with a blood-borne pathogen or biohazardous substance. There's obviously that hazard there. But an assessment needs to be made that other hazards do not exist. Above hazards, above fall hazards, tripping hazards, sharps hazards. All these different types of hazards need to be assessed prior to doing the work, prior to sending the employee to do the work. determine the PPE needed to protect against the identified hazard. So if I need a full bodysuit PPE to protect myself from the blood-borne pathogen, I may also need a hard hat to protect myself from a particular above fall hazard that can't be mitigated. Whereas that might not be needed in other cases. Employers must also provide PPE at no cost to the employees. An employee cannot be required to go provide his own PPE if he's willing to do the biohazard recovery work. Employees should remove PPE garments immediately or as soon as possible if penetrated by blood. I kind of alluded earlier to a decontamination area outside of the contaminated area, the cleaning scene, the biohazard scene. That should be properly set up, especially in case of an exposure. Should some sort of sharp or some other situation penetrate the PPE, the personal protective equipment of an employee, that employee now has to follow certain steps put in place defined by an exposure. And one of those is going to be to first decontaminate himself. And you can't do that without removing your PPE. So removing that PPE immediately or as soon as possible if penetrated, it's really nice to have a proper place to do that where you're not cross-contaminating one, the customer's home or contents or business, to other employees trying to help, the equipment we sent you with, or the truck that you need to go in, and then also definitely consider medical assistance if ever needed. Defining regulated waste. Regulated waste includes liquid or semi-liquid blood, contaminated items that release blood or potentially infectious liquid, items caked with blood, potentially infectious items capable of releasing materials caked with blood, contaminated sharps, and any waste containing blood or infectious materials. It's kind of a long-winded list to say that regulated waste is blood-borne pathogens or biohazard. If that type of liquid can't be identified, potentially infectious items still count as a biohazard. Or potentially infectious liquid. If you can't identify it, you have to use universal precautions, which, yes, means also that we're regulating that waste. Not us, it's the state that regulates, it's OSHA that regulates that how that waste needs to be disposed of. And we're going to look at how that waste is specifically disposed of as well later in the presentation. But the regulated waste itself, it's very feasible it needs to be controlled, because if we're transporting this waste that is potentially infectious to both us and others, it's a very high liability, and there needs to be steps taken and rules and guidelines and laws followed to dispose of that regulated waste. Can anybody at home, real quick while I shout out, can anybody maybe give me an example of what might be regulated waste? You can think about that. Besides blood. Dispose of infectious waste properly. Containers must be leak-proof. Place a first container into a second leak-proof container if necessary. Leak-proof is key when transporting or recovering biohazardous materials. And these containers or these leak-proof bags that are required that we use also must be properly labeled. Label containers as directed by the standard. Use red bags or specifically marked boxes and display the biohazard symbol. So that's pretty much it. OSHA standards regulate that all biohazardous regulated waste display the biohazard symbol as such. Now we also use these bags to bag regulated waste. We have large boxes that we put these bags in, and these boxes have lids, but yes, cardboard it does leak, and so it's not a leak-proof container. But the bag itself is considered leak-proof. These are very industrial bags that are provided to us through a vendor, through the state even, I believe. They are leak-proof. They are not puncture resistant, but they do adhere to the standard of disposal. So implementing a safety program. This is something that's required by OSHA for all employers that are performing this work, that are having employees perform this work. OSHA standards for biohazard are applicable and do define that a safety program does have to be put in place by the employer concerning biohazardous materials, exposure, and determination of what an exposure is, who could possibly be exposed, all these things, as well as training. Training needs to be involved in this safety program, and we'll get into that as well. OSHA standards for biohazard, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, their standards or their federal code of regulations apply, in this case, in this topic, apply to both general industry and the construction industry. Those codes, 29, Title Code 29, CFR 1910 and 1926, I don't mean to fry your brain there with that, it's just that these code of federal regulations include standards. And the most applicable standards within these codes that apply to me cleaning a biohazard scene are the standards of personal protective equipment, respiratory protection, and blood-borne pathogens. This is literature on these subjects and how these things need to be addressed. Literature that is standard, standard regulated by OSHA, Federal Code of Regulations. And so these standards must be adhered to at all times by both the employer and the employee. We both know that OSHA can visit a workplace, both scheduled and announced or unannounced surprise inspection. This can happen both at the workplace or at the scene of the recovery, at the job site. OSHA is free to both schedule an inspection at your place of work or at the work site. There's a lot of different industries that have a brick and mortar building that they operate out of that OSHA is free to inspect for workplace hazards, as well as OSHA is free to inspect work sites, work that is being done outside of the point of operation for that business. Can anybody at home tell me if OSHA regulates a single homeowner from cleaning biohazardous materials? The answer is no. OSHA only regulates companies with employees. And so OSHA standards do not directly apply to individuals who come across biohazard scenes, whether this is just you cleaning a little bit of blood off a handrail because somebody cut their hand. That's not going to be, if you expose yourself, you haven't also broken any standards because you're just an individual. But if somebody is contracted to do this service, if a company is there to provide that service and that company has employees, they are regulated by OSHA and need to adhere to the standards to a T. Not just because inspections are scary, but because exposure is scary. Nobody wants to have to go through life because with HPV because they weren't safe enough on a job site. So, the first thing in these standards that include PPE, respiratory protection, and blood-borne pathogens, these standards illustrate that an employer must create an exposure control plan. This exposure control plan is kind of long-winded and it carries a lot of different parts, a lot of different things that need to be completed in this control plan to be able to provide it to OSHA. Employers must develop a written exposure control plan. The plan is a key requirement of the OSHA blood-borne pathogen standard. Purpose is to eliminate or minimize employee exposure, and the plan is made available to both the employees and to OSHA. So OSHA can request your exposure control plan to be presented to them at any time. What is an exposure control plan? An exposure control plan illustrates for both the employer and the employee and OSHA examining that employer an exposure determination, a schedule and method for implementing the employer's blood-borne pathogen effort, we'll get into that, and procedure for evaluating exposure incidents, the procedure for an exposure. So if we look at the exposure determination, one of the first parts of a control plan. An exposure determination is the determination by the employer that these specific employees are at risk of being in the presence of a biohazard. Saying that means that these employees have a risk of exposure. So if I'm a biohazard technician and I've got an office manager who stays here in my office, my employer, ServPro, is going to say that I have a designation that they have determined that I could possibly come into contact with biohazardous material because they're going to send me to these job sites. I'm going to find myself on these job sites, whereas my office manager is left off this determination list. She is not trained in it. She will not be sent to the biohazard scenes. So I'm placed on that determination list. The individuals on that determination list have to adhere to the rest of the standards throughout the control plan. They have to be trained on both how to perform the work and how to adhere to the standards of the control plan should an exposure happen, should the employee have any concerns about how work is being done or what is being presented to them. So a list of job classifications, a list of job classifications where all employees have exposure in performing the job. A list of job classifications for which some employees have exposure in performing the job. And a list of tasks and procedures that involve exposure or potential for exposure. So that's your exposure determination. The employees and the job tasks that have the potential for exposure. The method for implementation. Document schedules and methods for implementing the blood-borne pathogen standards. It's long-winded for just documenting the employer's efforts for compliance with the standard Hepatitis B vaccines for employees need to be kept in this section. Records on that do need to be kept. As we stated earlier, an employer must provide the HPV vaccine at no cost to an employee who's willing to do this type of work. Evaluations and follow-ups for employees that have had an exposure. Past instances need to be documented and saved, kept. And communication of hazards to employees. When we were talking back about determining the hazards or creating a plan on scene and identifying the hazards, identifying a hazard at the workplace does absolutely no good if it never gets communicated to anybody. And concerning biohazard recovery, biohazard cleanup, hazards that are identified need to be documented as well as communicated. The communications need to be documented. I am Sean. I recognize that this is blood. We're going to use universal precautions and say that this is a hazard to everybody who comes into contact with it. I need to document, and my employer needs to document that I have communicated that. And record keeping. Post-exposure evaluation. So now we have an employee who has been exposed. There has to be a plan for that. God forbid, we never want it to happen. It's why we use our engineering controls. It's why we use our work practice controls. These are all standards in the Osha requirements, and our PPE and our respiratory protection. These are standards and rules set forth by OSHA. Should an exposure happen, there has to be a plan in place. Report the incident to the person who maintains the records of exposure incidents. Document the source of the individual's identification and status. Consult applicable state and local laws regarding the disclosure and identification. Offer the exposed employee the option of having his or her blood tested. It is still the employee's choice to have their blood tested. It is still a medical record and privy only to them, but needs to be provided by the employer should it be requested. After it's offered, and given appropriate counseling to the exposed employee. Even go so far as to need a plan for counseling after the fact should an employee become exposed. Opinions of healthcare professionals. This is still in line with our post-exposure evaluation. We have an employee, he's been exposed, we have to walk through this plan now. Written opinions are obtained when employers receive both the Hepatitis B vaccine. So this employee came to us. He said he was willing to do the work. We provided him with the Hpv vaccine. And during that, the healthcare professional does provide a written opinion about your health and the administration of the Hpv vaccine. It is not your medical record. It is still confidential to you, but also is provided to your employer. It is confidential under your employer's care, but is needed by them to determine that, one, you're fit to do the work, and two, to record that you have received the Hpv vaccine to prevent contracting that should you ever be exposed. An employee that has an exposure incident, you're obviously going to get checked out by a medical professional. That medical professional is going to provide your employer with a written opinion about your exposure because of the nature of the work that the employer does. This is not your medical record. It is not doesn't necessarily list what you may have contracted during the exposure, but it is a written opinion of the healthcare professional that is provided post-exposure by the healthcare professional. The written opinions do state whether the hepatitis B vaccine is indicated, so it's documented that you've received the vaccine. The employee has received the vaccine. The rest of the result of the post-exposure evaluation, this is what's happened, this is possibly the results, and any medical conditions resulting from the exposure to the blood or other potentially infectious materials. It does include whether you've contracted, and these are confidential between your employer and you and your healthcare professional. But it is not your medical record. Training to employees. Training is part of the control plan. We're working through our employee-provided control plan, and training and documentation of that training to the employees needs to be maintained. Training must be provided at no cost, of course. At the time of the initial assessment, whether or not he's willing to do this type of work, whether or not he can do this type of work, and the training must be done during working hours. You cannot expect an employee to attend training or proceed with training by himself outside of work hours. Additional training at least once a year. Biohazard technicians need to continually be trained in continual refreshing of the topic and also development of new methods. A person conducting training must be knowledgeable about the subject matter, so it is required that the trainer have experience, not just experience, but training also. The training must be appropriate for the audience. This is a very touchy subject. Most of the pictures I have here in this presentation for you are very G-rated in most cases. But even for the training of our employees, there's no other way really to prepare them for what they might encounter on scene, because the training must be appropriate. Topics for employee training include blood-borne pathogen standard. It includes a lot of what we've talked about blood-borne pathogens, what they are, how they work, exposures, symptoms of disease. There are some pretty high risks, specific high risks. We talked about those with both HPV, HIV, HBC is possible, as well as other infectious viruses and bacteria. And so the symptoms of these need to be covered. Hepatitis B vaccination in itself is training. Ways blood-borne pathogens are transmitted. We covered that slightly with the scale of the risk of exposure with this type of bodily fluid, with this type of bodily fluid. An exposure control plan, the plan of you've actually been exposed, it's time to move forward from that now. That plan needs to be communicated to all employees. They need to know what to expect should they accidentally expose themselves, and the tasks that might result in the exposure. Yes. Topics for employee training: use and limitations of work practice and engineering controls. There are obviously limitations to all these things. A sharps container, like we discussed, was puncture resistant and spill proof. These are both only to some extent. You could probably hit, if you ran over the puncture resistant containers, probably going to puncture. And if you've got nothing but liquid in a spill proof container, it still could possibly spill. There are limitations to these things, and they have to be examined. Personal protective equipment, these have limitations too. Obviously, puncture is one of the highest hazards that an employee faces. We have this personal protective equipment that protects my entire body. You could throw a bucket on me and nothing would get in, but should a needle or a piece of glass come into contact with my PPE, the limitations of it will let it proceed through and expose me. Emergency situations involving blood, reporting an exposure incident, and the post-exposure evaluation and follow-up. Employees should know what to expect as they move through the process of an exposure as an employee. And so just before we move on to training for employees, we're going to take a quick 10-minute break. All you at home can take your phone calls if you need, make it quick, use the restroom if you need to now, and I'll see you back here in 10 minutes.
You like to wind it down with 5 minutes left. All right, you're live again.
All right, welcome back, everybody. All of you watching out there, I hope you were able to get settled, maybe get something to eat real quick. So we left off with topics for employee training. We looked at the different topics that OSHA standards and regulations require that the training include, which includes the Blood-Borne Pathogen standard, literature on the standards for approaching biohazard, Hepatitis B Vaccine, the exposure control plan. Now we're going to look at training to be safe in the workplace, the actual training that the employee will go through as a biohazard technician. The blood-borne pathogens standard infectious body fluids may be present, or blood-borne pathogens and infectious bodily fluids may be present. Take appropriate precautions. Complete company safety training program for biohazard for blood-borne pathogens. Be immunized with the Hepatitis B Vaccine, vitamin. Be trained to wear appropriate PPE. PPE training is something that is not just required, but very savvy, because PPE can be used in the wrong way in so many different ways. And complete requirements for wearing a respirator. This includes both a fit test and a fit test, a physical fit test, and then a mask fit test. You have to be able to breathe under a strenuous condition, as well as have a respirator that fits you properly and seals around the mouth to make sure that everything's directed through the cartridges. So if we take a quick look here at, if I just put this down really quick, we can take a look at my respirator I bought. So this is a standard half-face respirator. It has both sides here for cartridges, which filter the air that I breathe through. So when I talk about a fit test and a physical fit test, I'm talking about being able to work with this thing on my face, being able to bring my heart rate up. I have to be able to bring my heart rate up while wearing this mask, and still be able to efficiently work while maintaining with the mask on my face. It can create claustrophobic fears for some. Others might not have a strong enough respiratory system to be able to perform work while wearing one of these. And an actual respirator fit test is a test performed to make sure that this respirator actually fits on my face properly. It has to create a seal all the way around my face to prevent any sort of contaminated air through my respiratory system coming in through the sides. It all has to be directed through the cartridges. If we take a look at a couple cartridges really quick, I'll just show you what these might look like. Now these are just really simple dust cartridges. The only thing they're going to hold back from my lungs are sawdust and other small particle materials, but organic vapors aren't going to be held back by these. I'm still going to be able to smell any sort of bad smells, and any sort of infectious agent might still be able to make it through these cartridges. But this is how a lot of crawl spaces are addressed. It's just right here with the pink cartridges. I'll come around right there, and that's a half-face respirator. With a half-face respirator, one also needs to, if one of these is required, goggles are also required. And so an employee will want to be protecting their respiratory system while also protecting their eye orifices. And so that is good face protection on a biohazard scene right there. You can see here I've got organic vapor cartridges. These are more cartridges for the respirator. These organic vapor cartridges do a lot more in terms of filtering contaminants that I'm breathing on a scene. And so these cartridges will also effectively, in most cases, eliminate the smell. Sometimes that's the hardest thing to get through on a scene is the putrid smell of some things, and an organic vapor cartridge goes a long way to not just reducing the actual contaminants, but the actual smell as well, making the work a little bit more tolerable. So that's respirator requirements there. You need to be able to make sure the respirator fits properly. It can't just be you. Somebody has to be present. Another employee, preferably a manager, has to be present to actually visualize that the mask fits right. And in some cases, smoke is even used to make sure that the smoke will never get it. The smoke won't move around your mask, and it'll make you choke if it's not fitting properly. Moving on to take appropriate precautions for both the scene that you're approaching, the scene that you're working on, the biohazardous situation, as well as for yourself. We're talking about making sure others approaching the scene know what they're walking towards, know the precautions that need to be taken, as well as you and your other employees on scene. Personal protective equipment, warning labels and signs are a big one. You could be doing some of the best work you've ever done, but if somebody walks behind you through a door that wasn't properly labeled that they shouldn't enter, there could be an exposure, there could be cross-contamination. So proper signs and warning labels do need to be posted in these types of situations. Emergency situations involving blood, employees should be trained on that. Biohazards are not just scenes that we often go to clean. Biohazards can also be created on a job site with an injury. Injuries can lead to further exposure, and so employees need to be trained on how to properly handle an emergency situation involving blood. Reporting an exposure incident. All exposure incidents need to be reported that happen on the job site. Not reporting it is not smart. Reporting a hazard or reporting an exposure protects you, protects the employer, goes a lot further to protecting you than you might think in some cases as well. So it always has to be reported. And the post-exposure evaluation and follow-up, again, an employee should know what they're going to have to go through and should be trained should they face an exposure. They should know that they're going to have to see a physician. They should know that their physician is going to provide the employer with some information about the result of that exposure. The employee should know that he can request counseling should the employee want counseling after an exposure. And so here we can see, well, that's a good biohazard sign. We'll post signs like this in extreme situations where only authorized personnel should enter. And those authorized personnel are personnel that know what PPE to use, how to use that PPE, and what's going on at the job site. Training records. So this exposure control plan, all the training records that are kept, the exposure determination, the standards, the method for implementation, the opinions of the healthcare professional, again the training, because training has to happen once a year at least. Training happens all the time. If an employer can recognize that training has happened in an unconventional environment, if it's documented, it counts as training. But all these records need to be kept. We've discussed a lot about the standards and regulations that have to be adhered to, which involve creating these plans and keeping these records and training employees on what to expect and how to handle these situations. All these records need to be kept. Employers must provide records to the director of the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, the Assistant Secretary of Labor for the OSH, for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and employees or employee representatives, which obviously representation such as lawyers or medical representation. Records must be kept for 3 years, even after the employee has left the business. So training that employee has received needs to be backdated 3 years. Once 3 years has passed, that can fall off the end, but all these records need to be updated continually. Exposure control plans that have new implementations need to be updated. Training that needs to happen at least once a year for each employee has to be documented. And so these things are going to be next dated. So you've just kind of got a continuous record for a biohazard technician and the employer he works for. Training records include these training dates, content or summary of the training, name and qualifications of the trainer, the trainee and the trainer, conducting the training, and the names and job titles of the employees attending that training. Here at ServPro of Salem, we do one quarterly training for all employees to attend. And these trainings do have different topics at different times, but they do address the standards and regulations that need to be adhered to. And that's done quarterly. We have a great office administration that documents these trainings for us. We've got a great bunch of heads down here at ServPro that provide the training in very effective ways, very knowledgeable ways. And so that's how we here at ServPro are able to, that's how we adhere to these guidelines and rules. Medical record keeping requirements. Now these are the written opinions from the healthcare professionals, both prior to an exposure and after an exposure. An employer must keep confidential medical records for each employee with a potential for exposure. Now, like I said, he's got the potential for exposure, and he's had a pre-exposure doctor's evaluation. He's healthy, doesn't currently have hepatitis B, HIV, has received the vaccine, results of examinations, and these are, again, written opinions. They are not your medical record in its entirety in any way, but they are confidential and considered as such a medical record provided to your employer. So it is confidential, and the employer must keep it confidential. Records must be kept confidential, of course. Records cannot be disclosed or reported to any person without an employee's express written consent. So situations like that might involve lawyers. I need my healthcare professional's opinion to be seen by this particular person. Records must be maintained for the duration of the employee's employment plus 30 years. So we've got the continual training records and exposure plans and exposure determinations that are kept for 3 years on a continuous cycle. The medical records and medical healthcare opinions involved with these, whether post-exposure or pre-exposure, need to be kept for 30 years, including the duration of the employee's employment. So if I quit tomorrow, my job here at ServPro needs to keep my records involving vaccinations, healthcare opinions, for at least 30 more years. And that's just what an employer has to go through to be able to provide this type of work, this value to a customer that may need it. All that is set aside from actually finding an employee that is actually willing to do this type of work. Some think that they're willing to do it and find out they're less capable than they thought. Some don't know if they would be okay with doing it until they've tried. And some just know flat out, I would never want to do that. I don't work at a hospital for a reason. So now let's move on to the actual cleaning and disinfecting process. What our technicians will actually assess and perform on the job site when addressing a biohazard scene or substance. The first step of course is to prepare the work site. First, we're going to evaluate all hazards. Obviously, we've come to perform some sort of biohazard recovery or cleanup in this situation or in this topic, which does present that hazard, but an evaluation and a plan needs to be created about, are there any other hazards? How are those hazards going to be addressed? Post-warning signs at the entrance for all work areas, that needs to be done. Biohazard, blood-borne pathogens, Kent Jones, 503. So this is like something that would be posted outside of a customer's residence to alert anybody who might be trying to make entry there, or even just come and give condolences. Sometimes that happens, sometimes you can't prevent against it, but warning signs are the best way to work with that. Remove unsalvageable items. So after you've created the worksite evaluation, you've moved on to the worksite plan, now we're actually doing the work. We are removing the unsalvageable items. These are items obviously caked or soaked in blood or infectious material. Porous items that soak the blood up or the infectious material. These items cannot be restored. These items do have to be removed. They cannot very effectively be decontaminated, and they are from then forward considered regulated waste, and that waste needs to be disposed of properly. In the training that I received, I was trained by the ABRA, the American Biohazard Recovery Association. And my instructor, he was quite a guy. He was pretty good at getting his points across about how this work is done, the value it provides, and how to protect ourselves as the actual technicians, which is number one. As a technician, as the on-site guy myself, my number one concern is protecting myself and those around me. And so in his description, in his short-worded description, he says biohazard recovery is very simple if you know how to evaluate and perform 4 key things. Pick it up, soak it up, cut it out, and throw it away. Now these are very broad and general terms used for a very not broad and very specific situation. But if you know how to perform these specific broad terms as it pertains to biohazard cleanup. So if you are presented with a scene that does create a biohazard to you, we're looking at, you know, there's multiple things affected, lots of material, and it can kind of be daunting. How do I even begin to start this task of cleanup? I have my PPE, we have work practice controls, we have engineering controls, I'm ready to go to work. But how do I start? Where do I start? You start by picking it up. Now just by saying that, of course you can't just go start picking it up without knowing how to do that properly. And we've touched on that subject by using mechanical means to pick things up that could possibly puncture your PPE. We've talked about in other ways using gloves. Make sure to protect protect yourself from contact with the material. And just the term itself, pick it up. There is a mode of transportation in this type of cleanup that dictates that you should remove the solid items first. If you've got bits and pieces, if you've got chunks, physical stuff or saturated things, they should be removed first. We're going to pick these things up. If I can't safely pick it up as a contaminated item with my hand, I need to find a different way to pick it up, and it needs to be transferred into a puncture-proof, leak-proof container. So we've picked it all up. Now, next step is to soak it up. So in some cases, and not all cases, this applies, but in the cases that this does apply, we're dealing with pooling of blood, pooling of infectious material, of body fluids. It's not crusted or coagulated yet, it's a pool of liquid. And so now we have to soak that up. We can't continue to pick the pool of liquid up, we have to soak that up. And so there's plenty of means of doing that. Like I said, if you know how to apply these simple terms to a biohazard cleanup scene, then you know that it's a lot more entailed. Blood or infectious material can be soaked up using cloth that is never going to be used again, cloth that will become regulated waste. It can be soaked up using absorbent, sort of like kitty litter, if you will, can be spread on a pool and it'll soak that up, and then the absorbent itself, or the kitty litter type substance, becomes the regulated waste. And those are the ways that you can soak it up, the second step. And so now we've done that. We've picked up all the chunks, we've soaked up all the blood. Where do we move next? All the absorbent that we used to soak up the blood, that turned into regulated waste, and we were able to get that into the regulated waste containers. Now we're on to cut it out. And so and this applies to a lot of the scenes that you might find yourself presented with, but in the case of a mattress, the mattress has a smaller amount of blood on it. It does not contaminate the entire mattress. The entire mattress is contaminated because you can't necessarily replace that one spot that has the blood in it, and you can't continue to use it because it is possibly an infectious material. So in this case, we have a mattress and it's got some blood on it, but it's not all the mattress. And if you think about it, it'd be pretty hard to find a leak-proof, puncture-proof container to put the entire mattress in. So what are we going to do? We're just going to cut out the affected material. The entire mattress is affected, but we are just going to cut out the actual physical infection of the blood, of the contaminated material. So there might be a section of this big of a mattress that we cut out. There might be a section this big of subfloor that we end up cutting out. That's because the material itself can't necessarily fit into regulated waste containers. So we have to reduce its size, and we're not going to reduce its size on the entire subfloor scale, but we're just going to remove the contaminated area. And of course the last step, as I described, was pick it up, soak it up, cut it out, throw it away. The last step is throw it away. Well, that we're pertaining to regulated waste here. And so throwing it away does not just mean take it to the curb. Throwing it away means that these materials are in a puncture-proof, leak-resistant container. The state of Oregon regulates how regulated waste is both transported and disposed, and so we need to adhere to those regulations and guidelines. So it's not just as simple as throw it away, but when applied to a biohazard situation, pick it up, soak it up, cut it out, throw it away, helps me a lot in determining the plan on how to move forward with these types of situations. Porous materials. Porous materials cannot be restored when they have come into contact with infectious material. They have to be removed or disposed of. Fabrics, carpet rugs, mattresses, pillows, furniture cushions, all these things are either going to get completely discarded or cut up and then completely discarded. There's no way we could restore a couch that had come into contact with infectious material. It's porous material, it's cushion, and it's fabric. We could clean the heck out of it, but it never really produces the peace of mind, and it also never really eliminates the risk of exposure. Preparing materials for disposal. These are porous materials still. Remove the excess contamination. Excise the contaminated sections. Cut it out. Remove was pick it up. Excise is cut it out. Decontaminate excise sections. We do use EPA-registered disinfectants. Benefact is just an example here that I have. This product is Benefact disinfectant. Disinfectants such as that are applied both to contaminated materials that are regulated waste and to non-contaminated materials that were in the vicinity of potentially infectious material. So we want to leave the scene definitely decontaminated, and so EPA-registered disinfectants are how we do that. These disinfectants are applied to contaminated material and regulated waste simply to reduce the risk both to the employee and during transportation that an exposure happens. An exposure may still happen, but maybe because a disinfectant was applied, the result was better than it could have been. And so disinfectants are applied to both the contaminated material and surrounding materials as well. Non-porous materials. Non-porous materials can be restored from infectious materials in most cases. Clean and disinfect materials, hard surfaces, such as hard flooring, different types of surfaces you find in your home, such as countertops. These types of surfaces can be restored after they've come in contact with potentially infectious material. Thoroughly wet, pre-cleaned surface with disinfectant. And that's right, I've said it once before in this presentation, you can't disinfect without first cleaning. And so, yes, after we're done cleaning a non-porous surface, we will liberally disinfect it. This goes to reducing the risk of an exposure, reducing the risk of the potentially infectious substance, and to work towards that peace of mind after something like this has happened on your non-porous material. So how does pick it up, soak it up, cut it out, throw it away apply to a non-porous material such as a countertop? Well, we're still going to pick it up. If there's chunks and pieces or contaminated material, we're going to pick that up and then we're going to soak it up. Whether we can soak it up with fabric that is going to be determined contaminated material, regulated waste, or we have to use something larger scale like absorbent, then we're not going to cut it out. In the case of a non-porous material, we don't have to cut it out, unless for some reason there's some way that infectious material is unable to be excised just by cleaning materials and disinfecting. Restoring hard non-porous materials, remove the excess contamination, clean the affected areas with an appropriate cleaning product, and then disinfect with an EPA-registered disinfectant. So here we have Serpro product, 353. This is a wall rinse. Something like this would be used to clean contaminated material off of a a gloss painted wall. If you're familiar with paint at all, the difference between gloss paint and flat paint can be all the difference in whether that wall can be cleaned or not. And so with non-porous surfaces, first you do have to clean, and then you can disinfect. It does no good to disinfect as an effort to clean and disinfect in one step. That does no good. You have to clean prior to disinfecting. I think we saw this picture in a previous slide already. It's just sort of an illustration of how a biohazard technician might address small amounts of infectious material, potentially infectious material, on a hard surface. Now these floor tiles, these laminate floor tiles, are considered a non-porous material, even though we've got seams, which can often create bound liquid within these, but that's why you have to evaluate each scene that you approach in its own way, because each scene is going to be unique in its own way. And as we know, liquids can find themselves in all sorts of different spots. And as the restoration vendor, it is our job to identify and find the places, all the places that this either liquid or potentially infectious material have gone. And so in this picture, can any of you at home watching right now tell me if this biohazard technician all that we can see of him is using his PPE properly. I'm looking at it, and I think, yeah, he's got gloves that are taped to his suit to reduce any sort of liquid seeping through the cuffs of his hands, the cuffs of his wrists. We can see kind of in the back there that his suit extends all the way down to his legs. He's protecting his footwear and everything, and I'm sure he's using a proper respirator if we had a full picture of him too. So yes, for what we can see from the picture, he is using his personal protective equipment properly. He's not handling any sort of sharp object or needle, so he doesn't need to use any more than gloves to address the liquid that he's there addressing. Decontamination of equipment, that's a big one. A big one that applies to us as a vendor mainly only. We are able to do this type of work because we adhere to these regulations and these guidelines. But one of the biggest oversights is taking the things you need to perform your job to a contaminated work site and then bringing them back to the point of operation. That obviously happens, but knowing that this equipment needs to be decontaminated every time it's used in the scene, on a scene that has potentially infectious material, needs to be decontaminated. An oversight of that could create an exposure. A little known exposure, an exposure that's not quite known as an exposure. This piece of equipment was on scene of a biohazard recovery, and it was not properly disinfected. And if that piece of equipment ever injures another employee, there could be a real issue there, being that it could be an exposure. So cleaning and decontaminate all equipment used for the project. Wipe off equipment surface with an EPA registered disinfectant. We've got our Benefact over here, so I'm going to wipe down everything I've used that I cannot throw away. Most everything I used on the job site to handle a regulated or a potentially infectious material is going to end up being regulated waste. My suit, my PPE suit that I use to cover my whole body and my shoes. I'm not going to try and wash that and reuse it. That suit becomes regulated waste with the rest of what I recovered. My gloves, likely going to become regulated waste. My respirator, if I'm on scene where I need to use a respirator, it's often that this is not regulated waste. It's often that I can keep my face and my respirator and my goggles out of the contaminated substance. And even if it does come into contact with the contaminated substance, I wouldn't go straight away to throw my regulator away. My regulator here, minus these cartridges, which are very porous, is a non-porous surface. My regulator is made of non-porous rubber and can be completely sanitized, broken down even into multiple parts, and completely sanitized and disinfected, should it ever need. A respirator is most often sanitized and disinfected after every use. That's just proper handling. But should it ever come into contact with potentially infectious material, I'm still able to clean this to a point where it is decontaminated, and I can use it again. Just like the equipment, this is considered the equipment that we're talking about. And so it has to be decontaminated every time. It's key. Otherwise, you're just putting yourself at risk. You're putting your friends and employees at risk, your coworkers at risk. And like I said, it's one of the most highly oversought steps of the job site process is after this work has been completed and we're ready to leave the job site, there's still that one more step. Everything needs to be decontaminated, whether here on scene or if we can make a transport and decontaminate elsewhere. The more you can do on scene, though, the better, because that reduces the risk of cross-contamination. So that was a pretty good coverage of how the employee is to perform the work. We've looked at the different types of procedures. We've looked at how a scene can be addressed to create that plan. If you just can keep it in the back of your head, you pick it up, you soak it up, you cut it out, you throw it away. These are the generals that will help you develop a plan to properly address a potentially infectious subject. So now let's look at preparing the cleaners. We've looked at how to actually perform the work, but there is some steps that need to be taken to actually prepare this technician for what he might encounter. Trauma and death scene cleanup. It is a touchy subject, and not all employees are aware of whether or not this type of work is something they're able to do or not. Of course, it involves, most often off the top of your head, is my stomach strong enough to handle a smell that bad or a visual scene that bad? And sometimes an individual just doesn't know until they've encountered something like that. Death scene cleanup involves psychological issues. Customers may be undergoing emotionally traumatic situations. And so not only does the employee have to be able to handle this scene themselves, they have to have the wherewithal to be able to handle outside emotion from either customers, other people on scene. As I described earlier, I was on a biohazard scene, and what stuck out to me the most was the congregation of a church that this individual had belonged to showed up almost in its entirety, and the crying was very loud and very well heard. And that was just the one thing that psychologically stuck in my head throughout that. And so being able to perform my task at hand, as well as be sympathetic to what has happened and sympathetic to these people outside, and even handling an on-scene customer who may have some questions, is one of the key aspects of a good biohazard technician. The technician needs to have a strong stomach to deal with dead body and odors. The type of deodorization and cleanup can be difficult, but also rewarding. I say this a lot about the services we provide at ServPro. There's not many people that call us with a smile on their face, but I feel a lot of pride in working for this company, because there's not many people that use our services that don't end up with a smile on their face. We get the customers that are distraught and upset. Something has interrupted their lives, whether it be here because of a biohazard scene or because of water damage or fire damage or some of the other services we provide. Something's gone wrong. We're here to make it right. And that technician, being able to portray that to a customer, that everything will be okay, or not even that, just be empathetic in some cases, can be hard to find an employee, and also very good to have. Customers facing an emotional time. Family of a victim, they face saddened by the loss of their family member. Think about the gruesome, they're thinking about exactly what happened. Often we, as the cleanup vendor, are not the first person to see the scene. Often first responders, personnel, family, neighbors are first to see these types of scenes, and so people can end up with that ingrained in their mind, and have something to say about it while we're there as well. And so expressing tact in these situations is more desirable than not. Confronted by remains, interacting with authorities and representatives or responders, there's very key subject there. Often we have to both interact with a customer and a first responder in these types of situations. And aside from the work that needs to be done, that itself can be overwhelming. And uncomfortable about living in the home until the scene is cleaned. And of course, that's where we try and pride ourselves, as being able to turn that frown upside down. There's not much you can tell somebody to make them think differently about what they think about something, but if you can do your work in a professional manner and be empathetic to what has happened, people might end up okay with what they've gone through. And that's what we want to do. And be good listeners, but not a counseling service, because we are definitely not that. We're not there to counsel anyone who might be having a good time. And even attempting to do that in even a minor way can go wrong. You do not want to try and direct or give advice, very much advice, to somebody who's going through something like this, something that is traumatic. It can aggravate people on accident. It can create distrust in ways on accident. Just erring on the side of caution for biohazard technicians to just be empathetic and listen. Listening is key. Obviously, listening to a customer who is very distraught about a traumatic scene or a traumatic situation that has happened, you're gonna have to take some time in some cases to not do that work just yet, but let's listen to this customer and let her or him get what's off their chest, because I can tell that that's what needs to happen right now. And so we kind of sometimes have to put that aside, whether it's before or after. This customer needs my attention right now. So exercise discretion and tact. Excuse me. Slide malfunction. Exercising discretion and tact is what I'm talking about in these situations. Undergoing an emotional experience is hard for some people, and saying the wrong thing is the last thing you want to do. Be discreet when taking pictures of a trauma scene. That's a huge one. That can just set people off, is the way you're taking pictures, the type of pictures you're taking, the smile on your face while you're taking pictures. Any small detail can turn a trauma scene into a headache real quick. And you have to be prepared mentally. Like I've said prior a couple times in this presentation, a biohazard technician who works for a restoration company, or any employee that works for a restoration company, or any company, cannot be forced to do biohazard cleanup. If it's a potentially infectious substance, which any blood is, under universal precautions, or any body fluid even, under universal precautions, that employee has to make the determination whether or not he's willing to do the work. He cannot be fired for not willing to do the work. He can't be punished for not being willing to do the work. And he can make this determination anytime, before he's sent to a job, while he's at a job figuring it out for himself, or after. He says, hey, I went, I did that for you guys, I'm never willing to do it again. An employer has to abide by this. Must biohazard cleaners be certified? And here is the trick about that. So we've kind of walked through a lot of OSHA and a little bit of EPA, but here we go with OSHA and EPA do not regulate the cleanup of mold. The EPA releases guidelines for mold, as we might have learned in our mold remediation class, if any of you has ever attended that. The Occupational Safety and Healthy Administration, OSHA, releases Safety and Health Administration on a bulletin. This is involving mold in the workplace. Asbestos cleanup. OSHA and EPA require appropriate training for asbestos cleanup. Asbestos training must be accredited, so you can't just be trained, but your training also has to be accredited and certified. And the EPA's model for accreditation plan is the Code of Federal Regulations 40 CFR. Those are the guidelines set forth about asbestos abatement from the EPA, the training guidelines. The asbestos cleanup accreditation component, competent persons completing training meet the criteria of the model accreditation plan defined by OSHA Asbestos Standard for Construction Industry 1926.1101. If you guys need any further references, that is a good reference, the OSHA abatement standard, but asbestos isn't our topic of subject today. Comparing the requirements, that's what these two slides have been leading to here. We've looked at mold real briefly and the regulated requirements for that, asbestos and the regulated requirements for that. So in comparison, mold cleanup, no OSHA standards or EPA regulations. EPA OSHA offered guidelines for mold cleanup and recommendations. Biohazard cleanup, OSHA has a standard, training is required, but accreditation is not. So I was trained by the ABRA, which is an accredited training program, but I do not need to have that to go and clean a biohazard scene. I'm grateful to my employer that provided me with the training, the accreditation training involving biohazard cleanup. But asbestos cleanup, OSHA standards and EPA regulations, training and accreditation required. And we might be able to guess why asbestos is a little bit more largely regulated, but I would like to pose a final question for our class today. But asbestos containing material is not regulated waste. Mold containing material is not regulated waste. Biohazard containing material, potentially infectious material, is regulated waste. And can anybody think why that is? I have to send my potentially infectious material to a very certain place for disposal versus the asbestos and the mold can go to the junkyard. Do you know why that is? The potentially infectious diseases involved with biohazard, the potentially infectious viruses involved with that continue throughout its transport, throughout its life, throughout its disposal. Asbestos and mold is an organic material. Mold spores are all around us all the time, and mold itself is organic. Nobody in the history of mankind is ever going to eliminate mold from this planet. So regulating its waste is kind of a waste of time. Throw it away, mold grows everywhere, keep it out of your house. Asbestos containing materials, asbestos is a mineral, a natural mineral here on Earth. It's actually an element found on the periodic table of elements. Asbestos, being that it is a natural mineral in our Earth, kind of lines it out for not being a regulated waste product. Whereas biohazard cleanup, potentially infectious materials, they need to be regulated. The transport cannot be overlooked because an exposure could happen. An exposure of potentially infectious material could happen all the way to the disposal site, which here in Marion County is a trash burner. There's a facility that burns a lot of Marion County's trash, and per ordinance, regulated waste, potentially infectious material, must be incinerated. And that's how regulated waste is taken care of here in the valley for us. And that's why asbestos exposure during a job site is highly regulated. Biohazard exposure on a job site, highly regulated. Mold exposure, pretty regulated. But the disposal of these different things is where the differences come in, and the standards for training. And so this slide has a prompt for any questions that any of you might have at home. You guys feel free to post on Facebook. If any of you have any questions, you can ask ServPro Salem West directly. We'll get right back to you. I'd like to thank my guests here with me for being here. I'd like to thank all of you out there for watching with me today. It was a pretty fun class. I hope all of you learned something, and I hope to see you guys next time. Besides that, have a great day. Call us if you need us.